Thank you, Sameena, for the very gracious introduction. And thank you, Professor, for your invitation. It's very exciting to be hosted by the MEI, and I hope that I will live up to your expectations. So, Mudassir, again, thank you very much for offering to switch the slides as and when needed. So the topic which Prof really was intrigued by is top five myths about Gulf-Russia relations. Now, all of us know what a myth is: folklore, conventional wisdom that's not really tested or testable. I like to think of myths also as built on half truths. In fact, I think the probably the most believable myths are those which are always built on a half truth, like the unicorn, which it kind of the half truth is that it's a horse. Like my childhood horror, which was Dracula, and that's based on the story of Led Tepes, a Romanian prince who was not very nice to his enemies. So myths are kind of based on half truths. And what I'd like to do today is to maybe highlight top five myths that we usually hear about Gulf-Russia relations, and then to go a little bit deeper to examine where lies the truth about these myths and where is it purely a myth. So, Mudasa, would you just advance the slides, please? So the first myth I'd like to introduce to you is this one, right? Oil or bust, myth number one. This is the idea that Gulf-Russia relations are all about oil or nothing. Next slide, please. According to the myth here, oil is it just encompasses, it's the main focus of Gulf-Russia relations. And that's partly because that the implication is that because they have quite similar economic structures as petrol states, therefore they have a very narrow range of trade relations. If you look at the graph there, you will see that Russia's trade with the Gulf appears to be increasing every year. And in fact, it is quite a decent level, around just over 4 billion in turnover. That's about 3 times more than was in 2005. But still, it's quite limited because that level of trade turnover, around 4 billion a year, is quite close to what Russia has with, say, Singapore or even Taiwan, which are much smaller in terms of population size, for example. Okay, so oil in this sense constrains economic relations to an extent, as you can see from the trade figures. On the other hand, of course, the myth is partly born also because oil kind of acts as the platform for the Gulf and Russia to engage each other, for example, through the OPEC plus talks, where the Gulf states most of them are part of OPEC, and Russia leads the other 10 members in the plus portion, where they coordinate about oil production levels so as to keep prices at a mutually agreeable level. So oil, on the one hand, it's such a big part of Gulf-Russia relations because it both seems to constrain trade. At the same time, it seems to be the platform for closer a dialogue. Next slide, please. But at the same time, I think we have to bear in mind as well that the cooperation that we see in, say, the OPEC plus talks, sometimes there is also quite a lot of competition during the OPEC plus policy talks. Russia would like to have a greater level of production, of oil production. The Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia tend to be a bit more wary about flooding the market with too much oil because then prices go down, and the Gulf states with all their different economic visions need the income from oil to realize these different economic visions. So part of the competition is there in oil policy. But at the same time, of course, there is also competition, not just in oil. So oil is not the be all and end all. There is also competition in other kinds of markets. You have competition in gas markets, for example, where Russia and Qatar, to an extent, compete over gas markets. You have competition in oil markets, for example, in China, where Russia and Saudi Arabia compete for the China market. You have also competition in other markets outside of energy, for example, in aluminum, where Russia is the world's second largest aluminum producer. But the Gulf states, like for example, the UAE, they are also big players in the aluminum market. And in fact, the UAE recently had a contract to supply green aluminum, not green color, but green as in environmentally friendly, produced by solar energy aluminum to BMW. So they do compete for not just in oil, but also in other kinds of product markets. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just about oil, it's also about other kinds of commodities, other kinds of products. At the same time, there is also cooperation, not just in oil, but in also other sectors. For example, in nuclear energy, where Saudis are really interested in the Russian technology for nuclear power station, where in terms of grain, the Gulf states are quite interested again to look at importing grain for their, for the cattle, for chickens, etc. Grain from Russia, which is one of the world's biggest producers of grain. They have cooperation in other aspects like space that you see there. Russia hosts, of course, some of these cosmodromes. Not only it helped the UAE to launch the first astronaut ever into space, but they've also hosted satellites from Russian locations using the Soyuz rocket as boosters. So there's quite a lot of other areas of cooperation, and oil is just not that single commodity that everybody just focuses on. Next slide, please. So the second myth then, I'll move on to talk about close political ties. It's kind of everybody, when you read about Gulf-Russia relations, there's an assumption that there are very close political ties. And to an extent, this is true. Next slide, please. They have a lot of high-level meetings, and you saw the picture there of the famous high five between President Putin of Russia and MEI-S. They have very close relations and these kinds of high-level exchanges of visits. Saudi king was visiting Russia. MBS and MBZ from Saudi and UAE respectively have had several visits to Russia. Underneath the top levels, you also have high-level coordination meetings obviously over OPEC, but also over other kinds of commissions on trade, scientific exchanges, etc. So there have been lots, there seems to be very high-level political ties. But, and here is where, we have to drill down a little bit. This is probably true of recent relations, very close political ties, maybe in the past 5 years. But if you look further back, there were quite a lot of incidents of diplomatic spats. And here I'll refer you to the diplomatic spat, for example, between Russia and Qatar in the early 2010s, when Qatar was none too pleased with Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war. And Al Jazeera, I remember they called Russia's Putin something like the 21st century dictator. So, there are quite a lot of diplomatic spats. Russian diplomats were stopped at Qatar's airport, etc. So there have been diplomatic spats in the past, and it is good to see that political ties are much smoother these days. But what I wanted to bring our attention to was a question of actually how deep these political ties run. Because if you look at some surveys, there are suggestions that the public in the Gulf states may not be as embracing of, say, very close Gulf Russia ties. So you see these two charts that I've created there with the help of Pew surveys. Yes, it does say that respondents in the Gulf and in the Middle MENA and the Gulf are increasingly favorable towards Russia and Putin. But look at those levels. If you look at that percentage, if you reverse that, it's also equally true that less than 50%, I think about 60%, have an unfavorable view of Russia and Putin's performance. So that's a little bit of a question mark, which I'll put to you. And it's not just the Pew surveys, because if you look at the Zogby surveys, those response of an unfavorable kind of perception is actually a bit higher. So that's something which I think it's actually worth exploring a little bit more. Next slide, please. The third myth I'd like to introduce to you is about the role of ideology. There are quite a lot of people who would propose that ideology is what drives Russia-Gulf relations, right? So ideology rules, ideology is the driving force. Next slide, please. And what kind of ideology are we talking about? Well, we are talking about ideology with regards to, say, mass revolutions, right? Your colored revolutions, your mass uprisings, that the Gulf states and Russia share a common aversion to this because they put a premium on domestic stability, on regime continuity, ideology in terms of the fact that they have common perceptions of terrorism, and this is particularly true in UAE and in Russia, where, for example, if you ask President Putin, is there such thing as a moderate terrorist? He very famously said, no, there's no such thing as a moderate terrorist. And if you look at the picture, you'll see that the different terrorist groups kind of look the same, and this is the perception that Russia has, and it's probably shared by MBZ in the UAE. So terrorism is a big no. There's no such thing as a good or moderate terrorist. It also seems to have some kind of ideological commonality because of authoritarianism. So both all the leaders in the Gulf states and Russia seem to have a predisposition for a preference for authoritarian rule. So this is where I guess the myth part comes from, right? That they share certain ideological commonalities. But I would actually question this myth quite strongly, because I would argue that President Putin, and probably the other Gulf leaders as well, are driven not by ideology, but by interests. You will find many Russian observers who will agree that Putin is as pragmatic as they come, right? That ideology is not a big driver of a lot of things he does. He's very pragmatic, he's non-ideological. I would suggest that if we look at this ideology versus interests question, you think about it in terms of your shopping cart, right? You'll go to your Walmart or to your Lulu supermarket, and when you think of shopping cart, ideology is kind of like the oil which we use these horrible shopping carts, which are always wonky, right? So even without ideology, even without the oil to oil these wheels, you can still push the shopping cart. A bit wonky, it goes left and right, you bump into people, but it still works, right? And ideology is there to just make sure that it moves a bit more smoothly and without the squeaky wheels. So I probably encourage you to think about it like that. Putin is very pragmatic when it comes to Russia's interests. If you look at his policies, he gets on really well, or he works well with Germany. And obviously, Germany has a very different set of ideological preferences when it comes, in terms of its commitment to democracy, in terms of its liberal market economy. It's very, very different. So it's quite hard to make the argument sometimes that Putin is driven by ideology. If you look at Putin's relationship with Lukashenko in Belarus, they have, again, very similar approaches and ideology, but equally their relationship is very conflictual. So I would say that this myth is something, again, worth looking deeper into because of the pragmatic aspect, because of the interests in Russia and in the Gulf. Next slide, please. So the next myth you have there is that of strategic partners, right? There are some assumptions that Russia and the Gulf are moving towards becoming strategic partners. Right? And so this is what I like to address. To what extent is this true? Do we see this manifested at all in their relationship? Next slide, please. And I would say that, well, to some extent, you could see some elements of a strategic partnership appearing. One of the most famous examples, of course, is that Russia and the UAE signed a strategic declaration in 2018, and UAE is the only Gulf state that has this kind of partnership with Russia. Another example I can point you to is the fact that the Gulf states in Russia are strategic in the sense that they recognize that Russia is a big player in the Gulf. It gives Russia the respect that it craves, because to be a global player and not just a European player, Russia has to be seen to be influential in different parts of the world, including Asia, including the Middle East, including the Gulf. And hence, this is Russia's strategic goal, to be seen as a global player, to have the global respect. And the Gulf gives Russia that kind of respect, the kind of profile, the kind of visibility. Another aspect of the strategic partnership, I would say, is that the two sides, the Gulf states and Russia, have some level of cooperation in North Africa. I'm referring to their activities in Yemen and in Libya, for example, where there is some kind of coordination in the sense that they do, to some extent, support the same side. So in Libya, you have the support of Khalifa Haftar, sending weapons, printing money, etc., to support Khalifa Haftar in Libya. So it's a kind of coordination. Those are some examples I can point to of a strategic partnership emerging. But at the same time, of course, I would question taking that into going too deeply into that, because on the other hand, you will see that when you look at the bilateral sets of relationships with Gulf with Russia, in some cases, in fact, in quite a lot of cases, the bilateral relationship is perhaps less significant than a third-party relationship. So what I'm referring to is, say, the Gulf and Russia's relationship with, well, I'll give an example of the US. For the Gulf, the US is perhaps more important than Russia. And similarly for Russia, the US is more important than the Gulf, right? So this third party emerges in the bilateral relationship. And the third party is actually the more important one, the one that actually drives the dynamics of Gulf-Russia relations. Russia, would like to be closer to the US. The Gulf would like to be closer to the US as well, but because of certain difficulties, then they kind of reach out to each other. So third parties, in that sense, like the US, like Iran, kind of determines the tenor, the highs and lows of Gulf-Russia relations. And the implication here then is quite significant, because it means that the Gulf and Russia can tend to be quite passive or reactive, because it's this third party that kind of has quite a large say in determining the closeness of Gulf-Russia relations in a strategic perspective. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well, that third parties play quite an influential role when you talk about the relationship between the Gulf and Russia. Finally, I would invite you to think about Syria, right? A lot of people look at Syria and say, well, look at Russia's involvement in Syria. That's military involvement. So that could extend to Russia's involvement in the Gulf. But I would suggest that Syria is simply not the Gulf. You cannot conflate Syria with the Gulf. What Russia does, its interest in Syria, is not equivalent to what it does or its interests or what it can offer to the Gulf. Right? Russia offers a security role in the Gulf, in Syria, for Syria, but it doesn't and it cannot offer the same thing for the Gulf, because the Gulf is just not a focus of Russia's interests. The Gulf is, for all intents and purposes, that it has a very strong American presence, and Russia actually likes, or not likes, but it benefits from the strong American presence. It free rides on the security of the sea lanes, etc. It is not there to supplant the American presence, security role in the Gulf. It would like the American presence to be a bit less significant, but Russia is not willing to supplant American presence in the Gulf, nor does Russia have the resources to even think of supplanting America's presence in the Gulf. Next slide, please. So I'm looking at the time. That's why I'm going on to the fifth and the final myth, which is a uniform approach, right? Next slide. There seems to be some kind of, an acceptance that, the Gulf has quite similar approaches when it comes to Russia. It tries to buy Russia's support, for instance, by dangling some carrots in terms of investment and economic support. The Gulf tends to sometimes use Russia to signal to America its intentions or that it's got alternatives. The Gulf sometimes tends to use Russia to signal to, say, Qatar, for example. Qatar uses Russia to signal to other Gulf states, for example, that it's got some other leeway during the blockade. On Russia's part, so it seems to have a similar approach in using the Russian Direct Investment Fund to lead Russian approaches to the Gulf. So Russian approaches seem to be quite commercial and economically dominated. So they seem to have quite a uniform approach when you're talking about Gulf-Russia relations. But here again, if you dig a little deeper, the Gulf actually approaches Russia in quite different ways, right? And the relations, if you look at each separate Gulf state, are quite different. It's not really similar when it comes to the relations with Russia. UAE is the most engaged with Russia in terms of the broad multi-sector engagement of Russia. It is, of course, Russia's largest trade partner. It's got lots of investments with Russia, and it engages with Russia in different fields. Now, Saudi relations with Russia are a little bit more complex because for a long time, quite a lot of Russian people, a lot of Russian elites were a little bit wary of Saudi donations, for example, to various Muslim causes in Chechnya, etc. Relations were a bit tense. With the suspicion that maybe Saudis were financing some of these civil wars in Syria, which had a blowback impact on Russian stability. Russia and Saudi are competitors to an extent in China, in the oil market, and you don't see that same level of competition between, say, Russia and the UAE and China, because China is not the UAE's key markets when it comes to oil. Japan is. So for many of these reasons, the relationship with Saudi is actually quite complex. And if you look at the relationship between Russia and Qatar, that's also undergone a rehabilitation. So if you recall, I had talked about how there was some diplomatic spats earlier in the 2010s between Russia and Qatar. And that seems to have been rehabilitated a little bit. Qatar has reached out to Russia and vice versa because of sanctions and because of the blockade. And so the relations are a little bit closer. Qatar, for example, bought into Rosneft, a big Russian oil company. Qatar has helped to finance the airport in St. Petersburg, which is, of course, President Putin's hometown. So, that the relationship has been rehabilitated to an extent. And you do find Russians actually comparing the Saudi and the Qataris and saying, look, the Qataris are actually they've been quite forthcoming with investments in key Russian areas, whereas the Saudis have not. Saudis have been talking a lot about investing in Arctic LNG in Russia. They've been talking about investing in certain oil service companies in Russia, Novomed or the Eurasian Drilling Company. This has been going on for many, many years, but nothing has happened, right? So that it's the relationship between the different Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar with Russia is, quite different. And it's not fair to just sometimes lump them as Gulf-Russia relations. Next slide, please. Finally, a few quick words about what I think about the future of Gulf-Russia relations. I think that for Gulf-Russian relations to move on to move on to a higher level, to more engaged and to be more a broader level, I think there needs to be diversification first in terms of economic diversification in the Gulf. Russia's economy is, much more diversified than the Gulf. It's not as petrol or oil hydrocarbon dominated as the Gulf. So if the Gulf states were to realize some of their economic diversification plans, I think that would give a wider scope, more scope for Russia and the Gulf to engage more economically. And with economics as the base, I think that can further lead to wider dimensions, including dimensions in the strategic field, right? How about the future of Gulf-Russia relations when we look at, say, weapons? Because that's quite a big interest that the Gulf have, as well as Russia, in selling weapons. Well, I think at the moment, Russia is just a very big player in the Gulf defense procurement market. Most of their weapons are from obviously American and European suppliers. I think for Russia to make quite a significant dent in the Gulf procurement market, it would require them, well, because at the moment the Gulf is trying to localize quite a lot of production of weapons. So Russia would have to be willing to localize some part of production, for example, of Kalashnikovs or the Sukhoi fighter jets in the Gulf, so that the Gulf can also fulfill their obligations for diversification, for jobs for locals, etc. I think also a final thing is about energy. I think that if they were both more serious, especially Russia, about renewable energy, we could see a scope for cooperation. Renewable energy at the moment is not on Russia's high list of priorities. So again, that kind of constrains a little bit some cooperation in that aspect of energy. So thanks to all of you for listening to these various myths and trying to unpick them. I'll now turn it over to Sameena as the moderator.